Look at this footage from the 19th of April, 1956. Grace Kelly, Hollywood's most beautiful star, stepping up to the altar to become the Princess of Monaco. The press called it the ultimate fairy tale. Millions of people watched, wishing they could be her. But if you look closely, past the silk, the diamonds, and the royal guards, you don't see the glowing smile of a bride. You see a woman who looks quietly terrified. Everyone knows the myth of Princess Grace, the wealth, the glamour, and the tragic car crash that ended it all. But what they hid from you is the agonizing reality of the years in between. She didn't step into a fairy tale. She stepped into a golden cage. And the royal institution that promised her happily ever after systematically silenced her, broke her spirit, and erased the woman she used to be. This is the private agony of Grace Kelly, and the secret price she paid for the crown. To understand the tragedy of Princess Grace, you must first understand the woman they erased. The media loves a Cinderella story. They loved the narrative of a beautiful, delicate actress who was swept away from her ordinary life by a handsome prince and carried off to a castle on the Mediterranean. But that narrative is a lie. Grace Kelly didn't need a prince to save her. She didn't need a castle. By the time she met Prince Rainier of Monaco, Grace Kelly already owned the world. In the early 1950s, Hollywood was a machine. It was a factory that chewed up young, naive women, packaged them into whatever the studio bosses wanted, and threw them away when they got too old or too difficult. Women in Hollywood were properties, but Grace Kelly was different. She wasn't a property. She was an empire. She was born into immense wealth in Philadelphia. Her father, Jack Kelly, was a self-made millionaire and an Olympic gold medalist. He was a man built on harsh discipline and ruthless ambition. In the Kelly household, winning wasn't everything, it was the only thing. But no matter what Grace did, it was never enough for her father. She was a sensitive, artistic child in a family of loud, aggressive athletes. She was the one Jack Kelly openly dismissed. He made it clear, time and time again, that he didn't expect much from his fragile daughter. That rejection, that deep, unhealed wound from her father, became the engine that drove her entire life. It also became the exact vulnerability that would eventually destroy her. Grace didn't stay in Philadelphia to be the quiet, obedient daughter. She packed her bags and left for New York City. She didn't use her father's money. She moved into the Barbizon Hotel for women and paid her own way by modeling. She fought for her independence. She fought for her identity. She wanted to prove, to her father and to the world, that she was more than just a pretty face in a wealthy family. And she did. She took Hollywood by storm, but she did it on her own terms. She refused to sign the standard, soul-crushing 7-year contracts that studios forced on actresses. She demanded the right to live in New York, not Los Angeles. She demanded the right to do stage plays. She demanded control over her own career. In 1950s, America, a woman who demanded that much power wasn't just unusual. She was a threat. The legendary director Alfred Hitchcock saw exactly who she was. The press liked to call her the Ice Princess, beautiful, cold, and untouchable. But Hitchcock knew better. He called her a snow-covered volcano. He saw the fire, the passion, and the intense emotional depth hiding just beneath her perfect, polished exterior. Hitchcock didn't treat her like a prop. In films like Rear Window and Dial M for Murder, he gave her complex, intelligent roles. He gave her agency. By 1954, Grace Kelly was unstoppable. In a single year, she starred in 5 major motion pictures. She was the highest-paid, most sought-after actress on the planet. And then came the ultimate validation. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her raw, unglamorous performance in The Country Girl. She had reached the absolute pinnacle of human success. She had conquered an industry designed to break women. But even with an Oscar in her hand, the ghost of her father's disapproval haunted her. When the press interviewed Jack Kelly about his daughter winning the highest honor in acting, his response was devastating. He told reporters, "I thought it would be my older daughter, Peggy. Anything Grace could do, Peggy could always do better." Imagine that pain. You are the most famous woman in the world. You are universally adored. But the one person whose approval you have spent your entire life chasing still doesn't see your worth. This is the psychological key to understanding Grace Kelly. She was a woman of extraordinary power, living with an agonizing sense of unworthiness. She had her own money. She had her own apartment. She had absolute freedom. She could date whoever she wanted, and she did. She had high-profile romances with Hollywood's biggest leading men, like Clark Gable and William Holden. She lived a life of total, unapologetic independence. But independence can be deeply lonely when you feel like you are never truly enough. By 1955, the crown of perfection was getting heavy. The relentless glare of the cameras, the invasion of her privacy, the constant pressure to maintain the flawless Grace Kelly image was exhausting her. She was tired of the Hollywood machine. She was looking for a way out. She was looking for a place where she could finally be safe, a place where she would be respected, a place where she would finally be enough. She thought she was looking for a sanctuary. She didn't realize she was walking directly into a trap. In April 1955, Grace Kelly boarded a train. She was heading to the Cannes Film Festival in the south of France. As part of her promotional duties, a magazine had arranged a photo opportunity. A brief, seemingly innocent meeting with the bachelor prince of a tiny, struggling European principality. It was supposed to be a simple photo op, a few handshakes, some flashing cameras, and she would go back to her life. But the Prince of Monaco wasn't just looking for a photo. He was looking for an asset, and the trap was about to snap shut. In the spring of 1955, the Principality of Monaco was dying. Today, we think of Monaco as a playground for billionaires, filled with super yachts, casinos, and endless luxury. But in the mid-1950s, that glittering image was fading fast. Monaco was practically bankrupt. The famous Monte Carlo casino was losing money. Tourists were staying away, flocking to the French Riviera instead. Worse still, Monaco was facing an existential threat. According to a treaty with France, if the ruling Prince of Monaco, Prince Rainier III, died without producing a male heir, the tiny country would lose its independence and be absorbed back into France. The Grimaldi family would lose everything. Prince Rainier was desperate. He needed a lifeline. He needed money. He needed tourists. And most importantly, he needed a wife who could give him an heir. But not just any wife. The prince's advisors, including the powerful Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis, who essentially owned a massive chunk of Monaco's real estate, had a very specific strategy. They told Rainier that marrying a European aristocrat wouldn't be enough to save the country. To put Monaco back on the global map, he needed American dollars. He needed an American icon. Onassis actually suggested that Rainier should marry Marilyn Monroe, but Marilyn's image was too scandalous for a Catholic principality. They needed someone who exuded class, elegance, and pure, untouchable grace. They needed the Ice Princess. They needed Grace Kelly. When Grace traveled to Cannes in April 1955, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. The meeting at the Royal Palace in Monaco was arranged by the magazine Paris Match. It was supposed to be a standard publicity shoot. When Grace arrived at the palace, Prince Rainier kept her waiting for nearly an hour. In Hollywood, no one kept Grace Kelly waiting. But when he finally appeared, he didn't act like an arrogant monarch. He was charming, soft-spoken, and showed her around his private zoo. To a woman who was exhausted by the aggressive, fast-paced men of Hollywood, Rainier's quiet, old-world European manners felt like a breath of fresh air. He seemed safe. He seemed like a man who could protect her from the overwhelming glare of her own fame. When Grace returned to America, they began a private correspondence. Letters went back and forth across the Atlantic. For Grace, it felt like a genuine, old-fashioned romance. She was looking for a husband, a family, and a way out of the industry that was slowly burning her out. But behind the closed doors of the Monaco Palace, this romance was being handled like a corporate merger. In December 1955, Prince Rainier travelled to the United States. Officially, it was a diplomatic visit. Unofficially, it was a hunting expedition. He proposed to Grace just 3 days after reuniting with her in America. She said yes. The world erupted in celebration. The press called it the romance of the century, the beautiful American movie star and the handsome European prince. But what the cameras didn't capture, what the public was never allowed to see, was the humiliating reality of the negotiations that followed. Because Grace Kelly wasn't just marrying a man, she was signing over her life to a foreign government. Before the wedding could proceed, the Royal Palace of Monaco demanded that Grace submit to a fertility test, a medical examination to prove that she was physically capable of bearing an heir. Think about the profound insult of that demand. The most desired woman on earth, an Oscar-winning artist, reduced to breeding stock. She was forced to prove her biological worth to a family she barely knew. But the humiliation didn't stop there. The Grimaldi family demanded a dowry. Even though Monaco needed Grace's star power to survive, the royal protocol insisted that her family pay for the privilege of marrying into their bloodline. The asking price was staggering: $2 million. In 1956, that was an astronomical fortune. Grace's father, Jack Kelly, the man who had always withheld his approval, was furious. He reportedly yelled, "My daughter doesn't have to pay any man to marry her." But in the end, to make the fairy tale happen, the money was paid. Jack Kelly paid half, and the other half? Grace Kelly had to pay it herself, out of her own hard-earned Hollywood savings. She bought her own cage. She didn't know it yet, but that $2 million was the price of her silence. To make matters worse, MGM Studios, the very system she thought she was escaping, saw an opportunity to exploit her one last time. They refused to let her out of her contract unless she gave them the exclusive rights to film the wedding. Her deeply personal, sacred moment was turned into a global broadcast, a movie production where she was once again just playing a role. On the 4th of April, 1956, Grace Kelly boarded the ocean liner SS Constitution, leaving New York for Monaco. Thousands of fans cheered from the docks. As the ship pulled away, reporters asked her how she felt about leaving Hollywood behind. She smiled her perfect, practiced smile. But as the shores of America disappeared into the distance, so did her independence. When the ship arrived in Monaco, the sky was filled with helicopters. Hundreds of photographers swarmed the docks. The crowds were deafening. It wasn't a wedding, it was a media circus. It was the exact chaos she had tried to run away from. On the 19th of April, 1956, she walked down the aisle of the St. Nicholas Cathedral. She wore a dress made of antique Brussels lace and silk taffeta, a gift from MGM. It was beautiful. It was breathtaking. But if you look closely at the footage, if you watch her face as she kneels before the altar, the nervous twitch in her jaw, the heavy, almost sorrowful look in her eyes, you don't see a woman stepping into happily ever after. You see a woman realizing, perhaps for the very first time, the massive, terrifying scale of what she had just done. The heavy doors of the palace closed behind her. The prince had secured his heir, his money, and his salvation. And Grace Kelly, the fierce, independent woman who had conquered Hollywood, had officially ceased to exist. The Princess of Monaco had been born, and her private prison was just beginning. When the heavy, ancient wooden doors of the Prince's Palace of Monaco closed behind Grace Kelly, the world outside cheered. They thought they were cheering for a fairy tale ending. They didn't realize they were applauding the locking of a cage. For the first few months, the illusion held. There was the glamorous honeymoon on a 147-foot yacht, the dazzling dresses, the endless flashbulbs of the paparazzi. But honeymoons end. And when the cameras finally backed away, Grace was left standing in the cold, echoing halls of a 13th century fortress, completely and utterly alone. To understand the specific kind of psychological torture Grace endured, You have to remember who she was just a year prior. She was a woman who could walk out of her New York apartment, grab a coffee, chat with strangers, and take a taxi to a Broadway theater. She thrived on the pulse of the city. She thrived on human connection and spontaneity. In Monaco, spontaneity was dead. She quickly realized that she had not married a man. She had married an institution. And that institution had no interest in Grace Kelly, the brilliant, independent artist. They only wanted Princess Grace, the silent, smiling figurehead. The isolation began almost immediately, and it began with her voice. Grace did not speak fluent French when she arrived. The Monegasque royal court was a rigid, deeply conservative circle of old European aristocrats. They looked down on her. To them, she wasn't a royal. She was just an American actress, a polite European code word for someone cheap, someone beneath them. When she sat at grand dinner tables, surrounded by diplomats and nobility, they would speak rapidly in French, often making subtle, cutting remarks about her right to her face. She couldn't defend herself. The woman whose voice had captivated millions on the silver screen was effectively rendered mute in her own dining room. She was a ghost haunting her own life. But the language barrier was only the first lock on the cage. The true erasure of Grace Kelly came when Prince Rainier enacted a devastating new law in the Principality. He banned her movies. Every single film she had ever made, the films that won her an Oscar, the films that made her an icon, the art she had poured her soul into, were strictly forbidden from being shown anywhere in Monaco. The official reason given was that it was inappropriate for the sovereign princess to be seen embracing other men on screen. But the psychological reality was far darker. By banning her films, the palace was erasing her history. They were sending her a clear, brutal message. Your past does not exist. Your achievements do not matter. The woman you used to be is dead. Imagine the profound grief of that erasure. Imagine having your entire life's work, the thing that brought you the most joy and pride, treated as a dirty secret that must be hidden away. She wasn't just asked to stop acting. She was forced to pretend she had never been an actor at all. And in the absence of her art, she was suffocated by protocol. The rules of her new existence were agonizingly precise. She was told what she could wear, who she could speak to, and exactly how long she was allowed to smile. She could no longer cross her legs in public. She could not wear a hat with a brim wider than a few inches. She could not walk ahead of her husband. She could not have an opinion on politics or the world. Her schedule was dictated by courtiers. Her days became an endless, numb parade of cutting ribbons, opening hospitals, hosting charity galas, and shaking the hands of people who didn't actually care about her soul, only her title. The palace itself became a physical manifestation of her depression. It was perched high on a massive rock, overlooking the sea. It was beautiful from the outside, but inside, it was a dark, drafty, intimidating labyrinth of stone and velvet. It was built centuries ago to keep enemies out. Now, it was keeping her in. In her private letters to her friends back in Hollywood, letters that reveal the true depth of her agony, Grace wrote about the overwhelming, crushing loneliness. She wrote about the damp cold of the palace that seemed to seep into her bones. She missed the bright lights of the studios. She missed the laughter of directors. She missed the smell of the makeup trailers. She missed being a person. She was surrounded by hundreds of servants, guards, and courtiers. Yet she had absolutely no one to talk to. Her husband, Prince Rainier, was consumed by the demanding business of running a country. He was often distant, stressed, and emotionally unavailable. The warmth she thought she had found in him during their brief courtship evaporated under the harsh lights of statecraft. To cope with the unbearable weight of her reality, Grace began to change. The vibrant, fiery woman Alfred Hitchcock once knew started to fade. People who visited her during those years noted a deep, unshakable sadness in her eyes. The famous ice princess had been frozen completely solid by her circumstances. She turned to charity work, throwing herself into raising her 3 children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, with a fierce, protective love. She wanted to give them the warmth she never received from her own father and the freedom she had lost in her marriage. Her children became her only tether to sanity. But even motherhood was monitored by the state. Her children belonged to Monaco before they belonged to her. As the 1950s bled into the 1960s, Grace Kelly was slowly dying on the inside. She was performing the role of a lifetime, the flawless princess, the dutiful wife, the perfect symbol of elegance. It was the greatest acting job she ever did, and she was doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no director to yell, "Cut." She was trapped in a nightmare, dressed up as a daydream. But then, in 1962, a ghost from her past reached out across the Atlantic. A script arrived at the palace. It was from Alfred Hitchcock. He wanted her back. He offered her the lead role in his new psychological thriller, Marnie. For one brief shining moment, the door to the cage swung open. Grace Kelly saw a chance to breathe again. She saw a chance to resurrect the woman they had buried. She said yes to the movie. She packed her bags. She was ready to go home. She didn't know that the system had one final, fatal betrayal waiting for her. She didn't know that the trap was about to crush her spirit for the very last time. By 1962, Grace Kelly had been playing the role of Her Serene Highness for 6 long, exhausting years. 6 years of smiling when she wanted to scream. 6 years of shaking hands, cutting ribbons, and suffocating under the heavy velvet curtains of Monaco's royal protocol. She was a mother. She was a princess. But the artist inside her, the fiercely independent woman who had conquered Hollywood, was trapped in a coma. She wasn't completely dead yet, but she was barely breathing. And then, a package arrived from across the Atlantic. It was a script from Alfred Hitchcock, the legendary director, the man who had always understood the fire burning beneath her flawless exterior, had not forgotten her. He wanted his leading lady back. He was preparing to shoot a dark psychological thriller called Marnie, and he had written the title role specifically for Grace. This wasn't just another movie offer. This was a rescue mission. The character of Marnie was a traumatized, sexually repressed kleptomaniac. It was a gritty, complex, deeply flawed character. It was the exact opposite of a perfect, smiling princess. For Grace, it was an irresistible challenge. It was a chance to sink her teeth into real art again. It was a chance to express all the dark, complicated emotions that the palace forced her to hide. When she read the script, something miraculous happened. The coma broke, the ice princess melted, and the passionate, ambitious Grace Kelly woke up. Letters from this period show her buzzing with excitement. For the first time in years, she had something of her own to look forward to. She approached her husband, Prince Rainier, with the idea. Surprisingly, he agreed. Perhaps he saw the deep depression she was drowning in and thought a summer vacation to Hollywood would cure her. Or perhaps he simply didn't understand the absolute control his own institution demanded. Whatever the reason, they struck a deal. Grace would return to America to shoot the film, and her salary would be donated to a Monaco charity. The cage door creaked open. Grace started planning her wardrobe. She started studying her lines. She was finally going home. But the institution of Monaco was listening, and the institution does not share its property. In March 1962, the palace issued a press release, proudly announcing that Princess Grace would return to the screen in an Alfred Hitchcock film. They expected applause. What they got was an absolute vicious explosion of outrage. The conservative citizens of Monaco were horrified. Their sovereign princess, working as a Hollywood employee, playing the role of a mentally unstable thief, it was considered a supreme insult to the crown. The local press turned on her instantly. Catholic newspapers across Europe condemned the decision. How could a Catholic princess be seen kissing another man, actor Sean Connery, on the silver screen? The backlash was deafening. The message from the people and the royal court was unmistakable. You do not belong to yourself anymore. You belong to it. For Grace, this public outrage was painful. But she was a strong woman. She had fought Hollywood studio bosses. She could fight public opinion. She looked to her husband, Prince Rainier, to stand by her. She looked to the man who had promised to protect her, expecting him to defend her art and her freedom. But he didn't. Pause. That was the ultimate betrayal. When the political pressure mounted, Prince Rainier panicked. He realized that the anger of his citizens and the disapproval of the Vatican were threatening his authority. Faced with a choice between his wife's soul and his political image, he didn't hesitate. He chose the crown. Rainier withdrew his support. He walked into her private quarters and told the greatest actress of her generation that she was forbidden from ever acting again. Imagine that conversation. Imagine the sickening realization washing over Grace. She had given up her country, her career, her independence, and her money to marry him. She had given him his heir and saved his principality from ruin. And in return, he couldn't grant her 2 months to do the one thing that made her feel alive. She wasn't a partner in this marriage. She was a prisoner of state. On the 25th of April, 1962, a second press release was issued from the palace. It was short, cold, and devastatingly final. It stated that Princess Grace had reconsidered her decision and was withdrawing from the film. Of course, she hadn't reconsidered anything. She had been silenced. To the outside world, it was just a scheduling conflict or a change of heart. But to the people inside the palace, it was a funeral. Hitchcock was heartbroken. He replaced her with Tippi Hedren, and he never offered Grace another role. For Grace, the cancellation of Marnie was the fatal blow. It was the moment the door of the golden cage didn't just close, it was welded shut forever. The spark inside her finally, completely went out. Years later, a close friend visited the palace and found Grace staring blankly out at the Mediterranean Sea. When the friend asked if she ever missed acting, Grace didn't smile. She didn't offer a polite royal answer. She just looked down, her voice hollow, and said, "I have shed so many tears over it, there are none left to cry." She never tried to make a movie again. The rebellion was over. The royal machine had won. They had successfully erased Grace Kelly, the artist. Only Princess Grace remained a beautiful, tragic ghost, haunting the halls of Monaco until the very end. After the cancellation of Marnie in 1962, the vibrant, ambitious Grace Kelly was officially gone. What remained was Princess Grace, a beautiful, dutiful shadow who had finally accepted the terms of her surrender. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the golden cage grew colder. The marriage that the press had dubbed the romance of the century had fractured into a polite, distant business arrangement. Prince Rainier was consumed by his work, expanding Monaco's wealth and real estate. Grace was left to wander the echoing halls of the palace, organizing flower, arranging competitions, and reading poetry to empty rooms. They lived entirely separate lives, often sleeping in different wings of the palace. The warmth she had so desperately sought when she left Hollywood was nowhere to be found. To escape the suffocating protocol of the Rock of Monaco, Grace began spending more and more time in Paris. She bought an apartment there. It was her desperate attempt to carve out a tiny sliver of independence, a place where she could walk down the street without the crushing weight of the crown on her head. But true freedom was impossible. She was a prisoner of her own myth. As she entered her 50s, the toll of her profound unhappiness began to show. The media, which had spent decades worshipping her flawless beauty, grew cruel. They criticized her weight. They scrutinized every wrinkle. They compared her to her younger, rebellious daughters, Princess Caroline and Princess Stephanie. Her daughters, in many ways, were acting out the freedom that Grace had been forced to bury. They dated wildly. They defied protocol, and they refused to be silenced by the palace. Grace tried fiercely to protect them. She knew exactly what the institution of Monaco could do to a woman's spirit, and she didn't want her girls to be crushed by the same machinery that had destroyed her. But the tension of managing her rebellious daughters, a distant husband, and a deeply unfulfilling life took a massive toll on her health. She suffered from severe migraines. She was exhausted. The woman who had everything was completely hollowed out. And then came the fateful morning of the 13th of September 1982. Grace and her 7-year-old daughter, Stephanie, were staying at Rock Angel, the royal family's country retreat in the mountains above Monaco. They needed to return to the palace to prepare for Stephanie's upcoming school term in Paris. The back of their dark green Rover 3500 was loaded with heavy dresses and hat boxes. Normally, a royal chauffeur would drive. But Grace, perhaps craving a rare moment of control, or perhaps wanting privacy to argue with her rebellious teenage daughter, dismissed the driver. She insisted on driving herself. It was a decision that would seal her tragic fate. The route back to Monaco involved navigating the Moyenne Corniche, a notoriously steep, winding and treacherous mountain road hugging the cliffs of the French Riviera. In a dark, poetic twist of irony, these were the exact same winding roads where she had filmed the thrilling car chase scene in Alfred Hitchcock's To Catch a Thief, the very movie that had first introduced her to the beauty of the French Riviera. As the car approached a sharp 120-degree hairpin turn known as the Devil's Curse, something went terribly wrong. Grace suffered a sudden, mild cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke. Pause. She lost consciousness for just a fraction of a second, but on that road, a fraction of a second was all it took. Her foot missed the brake and slammed onto the accelerator. The heavy rover smashed through the low stone retaining wall. It plunged off the edge of the cliff, tumbling violently down the mountainside, crashing through trees and rocks for over 120 feet before finally coming to a horrific, crushing stop in a garden below. The immediate aftermath was a scene of unimaginable horror. Stephanie had survived with a fractured neck and concussion, but Grace was in critical condition. She had suffered massive, catastrophic brain damage. Even in this moment of raw human tragedy, the institution of Monaco prioritized its image over the truth. The palace's initial press release was heavily sanitized. They told the world that Princess Grace had merely suffered a broken leg and a few minor injuries. They wanted to maintain the illusion of control. They wanted to protect the fairy tale. But the reality inside the Monaco hospital was grim. Grace Kelly was connected to life support machines, her brilliant mind completely and irreversibly gone. The final decision rested with Prince Rainier. And on the evening of the 14th of September, 1982, with the consent of her children, the machines were turned off. Pause. Grace Kelly died at the age of 52. The woman whose entire adult life had been controlled, managed, and dictated by powerful men and ancient institutions did not even get to choose how her story ended. The funeral on September 18 was a global spectacle. Nearly 100 million people watched the broadcast. Heads of state, Hollywood legends, and European royalty filled the St. Nicholas Cathedral, the exact same church where she had been married 26 years earlier. Among the mourners was a young, tearful Princess Diana, who would later suffer her own tragic end in a terrifyingly similar collision of royalty, media, and a fatal car crash. The world wept for the loss of a fairy tale. Newspapers printed glowing tributes to the perfect princess who had lived a perfect life, only to be taken too soon. But that was the final, ultimate betrayal. The myth they printed was a lie. The world mourned the death of Princess Grace in 1982, but they didn't realize that Grace Kelly, the artist, the independent spirit, the woman of fire and passion, had already died 2 decades earlier. She died the moment the heavy doors of the palace locked behind her. She died the day her films were banned. She died the day her rescue mission was cancelled. The institution of Monaco took an American icon and turned her into a beautifully dressed prisoner. They took her voice, they took her art, and ultimately, the winding roads of her royal domain took her life. There is a photograph of Grace taken in her later years at a glamorous royal gala. She is dripping in diamonds, wearing a magnificent gown, surrounded by the elite of the world. But if you look closely at her eyes, the smile never quite reaches them. She looks like a woman staring out through the bars of a cell. Grace Kelly achieved what millions of people only dream of. She became Hollywood royalty, and then she became actual royalty. But her life stands as a dark, haunting warning. A cage is still a cage, no matter how much gold it's made of. And sometimes, the most dangerous fairy tales are the ones that actually come true. If you found the truth behind the glamour as haunting as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe to Mary of Shadows. The history they teach you is never the whole story. Until next time, Keep looking behind the veil.